So here we are, another February 2024. So in celebration of Black History Month, we're going to do a series on Black wealth building. I'm not a social scientist, historian, sociologist, nothing of the sort. So we're going to do videos looking at the history, how we got here, where we are now, and how do we move from this place. So today's video is going to be about the consequences of history, right? Because we have to look at how do we get here, the consequences of. So we're going to look at how do we get here, where are we, and where do we go from here in regards to Black wealth. And we're just going to sit back and talk like you were in my kitchen. We're going to sit back and talk and have a conversation. Everybody already know that Black Americans came here as slaves. And because of that history, there is consequences. History has consequences, right? So Black people came here against their will as slaves in an inhumane condition of chattel slavery. No defending it. It's just what happened. And because of the history of how we got here, it will explain where we are all these hundreds of years later. So when you come here as slaves, treated as property for hundreds of years, working for no wages, right? And that happens generation after generation after generation. Other people are benefiting from your labor, but you're not benefiting from your labor, and neither your children or your descendants. That continues for hundreds of years. Then, at the end of slavery, right after the Civil War, promises were made at the end of the Civil War, I believe by President Abraham Lincoln, that they were going to get 40 acres and a mule, I believe, to kind of let these newly freed people have a starting position. But how many know that after the assassination of President Lincoln, President Johnson decided he was not going to do that? No 40 acres, no mule. So now you have all these people who are no possessions, they have no wealth at all, and promises were made to them. It was broken. I believe President Johnson decided he was going to create the Freedmen's Bank. I believe that's what it's called, the new Freedmen's Bank, which was going to store up the hundreds of millions of dollars that for the newly freed slaves. They'd be able to deposit money and so on. But the people who actually running the bank were white. So the people who were to benefit from the Freedmen's Bank were the newly freed slaves. But how many know that the people who were actually running the bank were white people and not slaves at all? And they took lots of risky investments with the money in the Freedmen's Bank, and it ultimately failed. So all that millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, or whatever it was, just evaporated. That was to benefit the newly freed slaves. So, right now, we fast forward to the Jim Crow era, right? These are the descendants of slaves, but now the Jim Crow era was white only restaurants, white only schools, white only neighborhoods, drinking fountain, the whole thing, right? It was separate and unequal. And of course, how many already know that the better quality was going to be for the whites, and the poorer quality and inferior quality, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, whether it be stores, whatever it was, it would be the better quality for the whites and the poor quality for the black. Right? This is history. Right? This is what happened. This went on for public transportation. The part of blacks had to sit in the back of the bus, and if there was no seats, they had to get up and give it to a white person. This is what brought the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks to the forefront. Okay, so this is the history. Then you move a little further, and when they started building homes, and when they started building new homes all over America, the federal government would only back the mortgages or back the loans of homes in white neighborhoods. Right? They had areas which were black that was deemed unsafe, and they would circle it with a red line. That's where the term redlining came about. So, if you were white, you lived in a white neighborhood, right? Because black people couldn't live in white neighborhoods because of the discrimination and the racism. They wouldn't sell them houses. So if you were white and lived in a white neighborhood, you were able to get a mortgage from the bank, backed by the federal government. So the banks would be okay with lending money for the mortgage because they know that even if the homeowner didn't pay, the mortgage was backed by the federal government. Now the federal government would not, I repeat, would not back mortgages for homes in black neighborhoods. So therefore, the banks wouldn't give them a mortgage, right? Because if they fail to pay, it is not backed by the federal government, so they would get no mortgage. Hence, so the black person couldn't get a house in the white area because nobody's gonna sell their house to no white person gonna sell their house to a black person, right? The neighbors wouldn't want to live next to a black person, and even right, so they had to go to a black area and they couldn't get a mortgage. So the end result of all that is that whites were able to get mortgages, see their houses appreciating value. Black was not able to get mortgages and had to rent. And how many already know that the home value is the largest investment that most people have, right? On one side, you have people getting equity gradually increase every year. And on the other side, you have people paying rent and throwing their money away every month. I mean, yeah, it gave you a place to live for 30 days, but at the end of the day, you're not going to have any equity. One person's going to have equity, increasing appreciation, right? They can borrow against the house. They can pass the house down. Um, they can do a lot of things to benefit their family. Take out the loan against the house, home equity line of credit, for education, for marriages, for business startup, and this person just has a lease. So devastating, devastating. But this is what happened, and even now, years later, we see the consequences. Right, the tendency to see whites in the surrounding suburbs in homes and blacks in the inner cities concentrated in buildings and apartments and projects. Right, renting. Um, and obviously, we know that when you have lots of poverty concentrated in a certain area, it leads to other things, such as crime and poor schools, and so on. So we fast forward and we see the institution of welfare by the government, instituted by the government for poor people. Right? It was well known that the family, the families, specifically the woman, would get more money if there was no man, husband associated with the family, if he was not in the house. So, you know, that was kind of an incentive to help to separate the family. Money was coming in from the government, but the family structure was broken, and that led to all types of negative consequences, right? The single parent household, the bad behavior, the increase in juvenile delinquency, a whole host of other issues. So this is just to set the foundation. So this is where we are now. This is where we are now, to the point where 70%, somewhere around 70% of all Black children are born in single family household. Okay, so we know this is the first video. It's tough. It seemingly had nothing to do with finances, but we're gonna build, and we're gonna build the foundation. We're gonna endeavor to do a video every weekday for the Black History Month. At the end of this series, we're gonna have a very good idea of how we got here, where are we now, and how do we move from this place to break the cycle of generational poverty. MD Investor out. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube.